William Will Harper, an 88-year-old black veteran whose quiet strength carried a promise across decades. In a sleepy southern town, where a forgotten cemetery lies hidden beyond the hum of the highway, Will knelt every Sunday placing wildflowers at the weathered headstone of Lieutenant Daniel Pierce, a comrade lost in 1968. But when a single photograph of his solitary act went viral, a stunning revelation shook the nation just 3 days after his serene passing. At that very grave, the Pentagon called his name, unearthing a heroic past long concealed. The discovery of Will's buried medals and a heartfelt note confessing a debt to Pierce transformed a community, turning one man's silent vow into a legacy of unwavering loyalty, from a life overlooked to a story that will move you to tears. Will's journey redefines what it means to honor a friend. Where are you watching from today? If you believe no sacrifice should fade into silence, stay with us, because this tale of an old veteran's devotion will leave you forever changed. The cemetery lay shrouded in morning fog, its overgrown paths a silent testament to years of neglect tucked away just beyond the hum of the highway. Here William Harper, a 88-year-old veteran worn by time, was found slumped against a weathered headstone. His body still as the dawn, his outstretched hand brushed a cluster of fresh buttercups he'd just placed at the grave's base, now tangled and disordered from his fall. The flowers, vibrant against the mossy stone, bore the name Lieutenant Daniel Pierce, USMC, killed in action, 1968. Will's rain-soaked coat clung to his frail shoulders, its frayed edges pooling in the damp grass, while his worn cap rested nearby, caught in a tuft of weeds, as if blown free by a mournful gust. To the police who arrived at first light, he seemed a wanderer, a solitary figure who'd strayed too far and met a lonely end. His face, carved with deep lines of hardship, held a quiet resolve that stirred unease in the officer who first knelt beside him. No signs of violence marked the scene, no traces of struggle, only a stillness that suggested he'd chosen this place to rest forever. The coroner, jotting notes beneath a heavy sky, suggested a heart attack or exhaustion, ready to write Will off as a vagrant with no one to mourn him. But as they lifted his body to a stretcher, an officer's hand brushed against a bulge in Will's coat, revealing a sealed envelope hidden in an inner pocket. Its paper was brittle, yellowed by years, marked with a military unit designation in faded ink, and the words, "Open only upon my death," scrawled in unsteady handwriting, sealed with a wax stamp that gleamed with eerie authority. The find halted the small group of responders, their breath catching in the chill air. This wasn't the keepsake of a homeless man. It was a deliberate act, a secret meant to outlive him. The officer, a young man with steady hands, held the envelope gingerly, its weight pressing against his palms like a whispered challenge. The cemetery, frozen in time, seemed to pulse with unanswered questions. Who was this man, and why had he died here beside a grave? No one else seemed to know. The police chief, gruff and practical, ordered the envelope secured as evidence, muttering it was probably just an old man's eccentricity. Yet the officer who'd found it felt a shiver of something larger, a sense that they'd uncovered the edge of a hidden truth. The headstone, its letters softened by decades of rain, stood like a sentinel guarding a story yet to be told. The buttercups, though disheveled from Will's collapse, caught the faint sunlight, their brightness a stark contrast to the somber scene. The coroner, packing up his kit, paused, struck by the care in the flowers' placement, a detail that didn't fit the narrative of a drifter. The police moved with quiet efficiency, photographing the scene, their voices low, as if respecting the gravity of the moment. The townsfolk, roused by the flicker of emergency lights, gathered at the cemetery's edge, their whispers weaving tales of the old man they'd seen trudging through town, always solitary, always silent. To them he was Will Harper, the plumber who patched their pipes and faded into the background. But the envelope told a different story, one they couldn't yet read. It wasn't mere paper. It was a bridge to a past that had led him to this forsaken grave, a past that held him here until his final breath. The officer who'd found the envelope rode back to the station, his thoughts tangled with possibilities. Was this man a soldier? A keeper of secrets? Or something the town had failed to see? The cemetery, with its broken stones and whispered winds, seemed to guard its truths, waiting for someone to claim them. The chief, though skeptical, filed a report to the county, expecting it to be the end of a sad, small story. But the envelope with its cryptic words and military seal was no ordinary relic. It was a call across time, a demand for recognition. As the ambulance carried Will's body through the lifting fog, the truth about him lingered in the air, poised to unravel. His death was not a quiet, close, but a spark, a beginning that would soon draw eyes far beyond this forgotten place. The morning's hush was a lie, for Will Harper's story was about to stir, forces he'd never sought to summon. That envelope, now locked away, would soon force the Pentagon to act, raising questions about the life Will had kept hidden. 3 days after William Harper's body was found, the small-town police station received a call that sent a chill through the room. The voice on the line, clipped and urgent, belonged to a Pentagon official named Major Evelyn Carter. She demanded the exact coordinates of the grave where Will had died, her tone betraying a mix of disbelief and haste. "Repeat the name," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "William Harper. Are you certain?" The officer on duty, still haunted by the image of Will's lifeless hand clutching wildflowers, fumbled through his notes, confirming the details. Major Carter went silent for a moment, as if the weight of the name had stopped her breath. Then she asked for the envelope, the one with the military seal found in Will's coat. The officer, puzzled but compliant, described it, yellowed, sealed with wax, marked with a unit designation that meant nothing to him but clearly meant everything to her. "Send it to us immediately," she ordered, her words sharp as a blade. The call ended abruptly, leaving the officer staring at the phone, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a routine inquiry. It was a signal that Will Harper was no ordinary man. The police chief who'd dismissed Will as a drifter now felt a knot of unease. Had they missed something critical? The envelope, now locked in the evidence room, seemed to pulse with secrets. Its faded ink, a map to a past no one in the town could have imagined. Major Carter, sitting in her sterile office at the Pentagon, opened a classified database, her fingers trembling as she typed Will's name. The screen flickered, pulling up a file marked "Restricted" with details redacted in heavy black lines. She cross-referenced the unit designation from the envelope, Alpha Company 3rd Battalion, 1967 to 1970, and found a match. Her breath caught as she read the name tied to it: Lieutenant Daniel Pierce. The connection was undeniable. But why had Will, a man who'd vanished from military records, been found dead at Pierce's grave? She ordered an immediate investigation, dispatching a team to the cemetery. Back in the town, whispers began to spread. The officer who'd taken the call told his partner about the Pentagon's interest, and soon the local diner was buzzing with theories. Was Will a spy, a deserter, or something else entirely? The cemetery, once a place no one noticed, became a focal point of curiosity, its gates creaking under the weight of new visitors. The police chief, now under pressure, sent the envelope to Washington, unaware that it would unlock a story buried for decades. Major Carter, piecing together fragments of Will's past, found a single photograph in the file. 2 young soldiers, one of them unmistakably Will, standing shoulder to shoulder, with Pierce in a jungle clearing their faces, lit with the fleeting joy of survival. The image was a clue, but it raised more questions than answers. Why had Will chosen that grave? What debt had he carried all these years? The Pentagon's involvement wasn't just protocol, it was personal. Carter, whose own father had served in Vietnam, felt a pang of duty to uncover the truth. She knew the answers lay not in the cemetery, but in the life Will had lived, a life no one in the town had bothered to understand. The envelope, now en route to the capital, was more than evidence. It was a bridge to a forgotten era, a testament to a bond forged in blood and fire. As the investigation deepened, the truth about Will, Harper began to surface, pulling the threads of his quiet existence into a tapestry of sacrifice and redemption. And to understand why the Pentagon cared so much, we must step into the shadows of Will's life, a world where he was invisible, dismissed by those who never saw the weight he carried. William Harper lived on the fringes of a sleepy town, in a crumbling apartment building where the paint peeled like old skin and the stairs groaned under every step. At 75, he was a retired plumber, his hands still calloused from decades of wrenching pipes and unclogging drains. The townsfolk knew him as the guy who'd show up with a rusty toolbox, fix a leak for a few bucks, and shuffle away without a word. To them, he was a shadow, a man whose limp and weathered face blended into the background of their busy lives. His apartment was a shrine to solitude, a sagging couch, a flickering TV, and a single photo frame empty except for dust. After Vietnam, Will had spiraled into alcoholism, a silent battle that cost him his marriage and drove his only son, Michael, to cut ties years ago, leaving a wound that never healed. Neighbors whispered about his drunken stumbles in the 80s, calling him a washed-up drunk who'd never amounted to much. The scar on his left leg, a jagged reminder of a war he never spoke of, only fueled their pitying glances. They saw a broken man too weak to pull himself together, too old to matter. At the local diner where gossip flowed faster than coffee, people speculated about his past but never asked, why bother? He was just Will, the guy who fixed faucets and disappeared into his one-bedroom cave. The landlord, a gruff man named Carl, once threatened to evict him for late rent, grumbling that Will was a liability barely scraping by on a meager pension. Even the kids on the block who'd dare each other to knock on his door saw him as a curiosity, a relic they didn't understand, but Will didn't care for their opinions. He'd learned long ago to live with the weight of their disdain, carrying it like the shrapnel still lodged in his leg. His days were predictable. Mornings spent tinkering with broken appliances for neighbors too cheap to hire professionals, afternoons at the library, reading old newspapers, and evenings alone, sipping black coffee to keep the old cravings at bay. The town's indifference was a mirror to his own self-imposed exile. He'd chosen this life, or so he told himself, because it was easier than facing the ghosts that haunted him. His son's last words, spat during a heated argument a decade ago, still echoed. "You're a failure, Dad. You let everyone down." Those words cut deeper than any bullet, but Will buried them just as he buried everything else. The townsfolk didn't know about the nightmares that woke him at 3 a.m., sweat-soaked and gasping, or the way his hands trembled when he passed the war memorial in the town square. They didn't see the dog-eared notebook he kept hidden under his mattress, filled with scribbled apologies to a man named Daniel Pierce. To them, he was invisible, a man whose existence barely registered unless a pipe burst. Even the local VA clinic where he'd once sought help for his drinking treated him like a number, rushing him through appointments with overworked nurses who didn't ask about the war or the scar. But Will wasn't invisible to himself. He carried a fire inside a quiet resolve that no one else could see. Every Sunday, he'd climb into his battered pickup truck, its engine coughing like an old friend, and drive to a place where he could be more than the town's forgotten plumber. The townsfolk, wrapped in their own lives, never noticed his absence, never wondered where he went when the church bells rang. They didn't see the man who'd once stood tall in a uniform, who'd faced death, and carried its shadow ever since. Will's life was a study in endurance, a testament to surviving when the world turned its back. His apartment with its cracked walls and leaky faucet he never fixed for himself was both a prison and a sanctuary. He didn't need their pity or their praise. He needed only one thing to keep a promise made long ago, a promise no one else knew about. But beneath that weathered exterior, Will carried out a secret ritual, a hidden act that revealed a side of him the town could never imagine. Every Sunday morning before the world stirred and the town's church bells tolled, William Harper rose in the pre-dawn dark, his movements deliberate despite the ache in his scarred leg. He'd pull on a faded flannel shirt, grab a handful of wildflowers, daisies or buttercups plucked from the roadside, and climb into his rattling pickup truck. The 20-mile drive to the desolate cemetery near the highway was a pilgrimage he never missed, not through biting winters or sweltering summers, not even when fever racked his body or his old wounds screamed for rest. The graveyard, a forgotten sprawl of cracked stones and tangled weeds, stood silent as he pushed through its rusted gate, the hinges groaning like a confession. Will's destination was always the same, the weathered headstone of Lieutenant Daniel Pierce, its letters worn by decades of neglect. He'd kneel in the dew-soaked grass, ignoring the pain shooting through his knee, and place the flowers gently at the base, as if they were an offering to a debt that could never be paid. His fingers would trace the carved name, lingering on each letter, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he'd say, "I owe you, Daniel. You won't be forgotten." Not today. The words were a vow, a tether to a moment he couldn't undo, spoken with a conviction that seemed to hold the morning mist at bay. He'd clear away the moss that crept over the stone-pulling vines with a tenderness that contrasted his rough hands, ensuring the name stood proud against the ravages of time. Sometimes he'd sit there for hours, his back against a nearby oak, staring at the grave as if waiting for an answer that never came. Other times he'd pull out a small leather-bound notebook, not the one hidden under his mattress, but another, its pages filled with dates and simple notes. June 12th, daisies clear today. It was a ledger of his devotion, a record no one else would ever see. The cemetery was his sanctuary, a place where he wasn't the town's broken plumber but a man bound by honor. No one knew he came here. He never told a soul, never sought recognition. The townsfolk sipping coffee at the diner would have scoffed at the idea of Will Harper, the drunk they pitied, performing this quiet act of reverence. To them, Sundays were for church or sleeping in, not for tending a grave no one else remembered. Will didn't care. This wasn't about them. It was about a promise, a debt etched into his bones. The wildflowers, fragile and unassuming, were his way of keeping Daniel Pierce's memory alive, a small defiance against the world's indifference. He'd chosen these blooms because they were free, like the freedom Pierce had died for, and because they grew wild like the spirit he remembered in the young lieutenant. Each visit was a battle against his own frailties, his limp, his age, the weight of years spent running from his past. Yet he never faltered. Even when his truck broke down, he'd walk the last few miles. Flowers clutched tightly, his breath ragged but determined. The ritual was his anchor, a way to silence the guilt that clawed at him in the night. He'd leave the cemetery lighter, as if the act of placing those flowers had lifted a stone from his chest. If only for a day, the gate would creak shut behind him, and he'd drive back to his lonely apartment ready to face another week of the town's scorn. This was his secret, a sacred act that defined him more than the labels others pinned on him. The flowers, the whispered words, the careful tending of a forgotten grave. They were his way of saying, sorry of keeping faith with a man who'd given everything. And though the world passed by the cemetery without a glance, Will's weekly pilgrimage was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let Daniel Pierce fade into oblivion. This ritual, steadfast and unspoken, was born from a searing memory of war, a moment that forever altered the course of Will's life. 15 years ago, on a gray autumn afternoon, William Harper wandered through the neglected cemetery, his boots sinking into the damp earth as he searched for the grave of a long-lost squad mate. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves, and the rows of weathered stones blurred into a maze of forgotten names. Then he stopped, his breath catching at the sight of a tilted headstone, its inscription barely legible under a shroud of moss. Lieutenant Daniel Pierce, USMC 1944 to 1968. The name hit him like a gunshot, dragging him back to a sweltering night in Vietnam. 1968, when the jungle erupted in chaos. His unit, pinned down in a brutal ambush, was caught in a storm of gunfire and grenade blasts. Will, then a young corporal, had frozen his rifle, slipping in sweat-soaked hands as bullets tore through the air. It was Pierce, the steady-eyed lieutenant, who acted without hesitation, shoving Will behind a shattered tree stump just as a grenade landed nearby. The explosion shook the earth, and when the smoke cleared, Pierce lay motionless. His blood seeping into the mud, Will scrambled to him, shouting his name, but the lieutenant's eyes were already blank. His sacrifice final. Will made it to the evacuation chopper, his body intact, but his soul fractured. He'd replayed that moment every night since the guilt, a relentless weight. Why had he survived when Pierce hadn't? Why couldn't he have pulled him to safety? Standing before the grave that day, the memory was as raw as an open wound. He knelt, his fingers brushing the cold stone, and whispered an apology that felt too small for the debt he owed. The cemetery was silent, but the ghosts of that night screamed in his mind. He didn't know Pierce well, just a few months under his command, but the lieutenant's courage had been a beacon in the chaos, a light that Will had failed to protect. The discovery of the grave felt like fate, a chance to make amends, even if only in a small way. That day he returned with a handful of wildflowers, placing them at the base of the stone, a gesture that felt inadequate but necessary. It was the start of a vow, unspoken but ironclad, to ensure Pierce's name would not be erased by time or neglect. Will had no family to share this with, no friends to confide in. The guilt was his alone to carry. He'd left the war behind, but it had never left him. The nightmares came often, vivid flashes of that night. Pierce's voice, barking orders, the deafening blast, the chopper's blades fading into the distance. Each visit to the grave was a way to quiet those ghosts, to honor a man who'd given everything while Will had walked away. He didn't see himself as a hero, only a survivor who'd failed his leader. The town knew nothing of this burden, and Will preferred it that way. To them, he was just a man with a limp and a past. They didn't care to probe, but in that cemetery, he was something more. A keeper of a memory, a debtor paying in flowers and whispered words. The act wasn't about forgiveness. It was about accountability, about ensuring one man's sacrifice wasn't swallowed by the world's indifference. Will's life had been a series of losses, his marriage, his son, his sobriety. But this vow gave him purpose, a reason to keep going when the bottle or despair beckoned. He'd stand before the grave, the wind carrying his murmured apologies, and feel a fleeting sense of peace, as if Pierce could hear him. The headstone, worn but proud, became a mirror to his own brokenness, a reminder that some debts could never be repaid, only honored. For 15 years, he kept this silent pact, never missing a Sunday, never letting the world's neglect erase what he owed. This quiet devotion carried on until a single photograph upended everything, thrusting Will's hidden vow into the open, on a still Sunday morning as dawn painted the cemetery in soft gold. 16-year-old Ethan Carter coasted through the rusted gate on his bike, taking his usual shortcut. His eyes caught a lone figure kneeling in the grass, carefully arranging a cluster of fresh buttercups at the foot of a weathered headstone. Ethan recognized the man not by name, but as the quiet old plumber who'd once fixed his aunt's kitchen sink, The man's hands moved with a tenderness that made Ethan pause, his curiosity piqued by the solemnity of the act. He'd seen him here before, always on Sundays, always with flowers, a detail he'd learned from Henry, the grizzled groundskeeper who tended the cemetery. Just last week, over a soda at the gas station, Henry had told Ethan's dad, "That old fella's been coming here with flowers every Sunday for many years. Never misses a week." Ethan, struck by the image of the man's bowed head against the faded stone, pulled out his phone and snapped a photo. He posted it to the town's Facebook group, typing, "Old man honors a forgotten soldier's grave with flowers. Been doing it for many years." The words echoed Henry's story, a quiet truth that felt worth sharing. He didn't expect the post to ignite a firestorm. Within minutes, neighbors in the group began sharing it, their comments filled with awe at the stranger's devotion. By 7 a.m., the photo had spread beyond the town, picked up by a local news page that called it a heartfelt mystery. Locals like the diner cook, who'd seen the man's truck parked near the cemetery for years, added their own memories, amplifying the story. Ethan, scrolling through notifications at home, was stunned as his post racked up hundreds of shares. Some praised the man's loyalty, others speculated he was chasing some quiet glory. The cemetery, long a forgotten corner, began to draw curious visitors, leaving candles and notes near the grave. Unbeknownst to Ethan, the photo reached Sarah Mitchell, a retired Marine colonel in a neighboring state, as she browsed a veterans group online. The headstone's name, Lieutenant Daniel Pierce, hit her like a jolt. She'd served with Pierce and with a young corporal whose face matched the man in the photo, though she hadn't thought of him in decades. Her pulse quickened as she sent the post to a Pentagon colleague, writing, "This is no coincidence. We need to know who he is." She didn't know that just hours after Ethan's snapshot, the man had taken his final breath at that very grave. The post's rapid spread was fueled by Henry, who'd shared it to a regional veterans group. His comment noting the man's unwavering ritual, Ethan, now fielding messages from strangers, felt a mix of pride and unease for thrusting a private moment into the spotlight. The photo, raw and unassuming, became a symbol of steadfast memory, resonating with those who'd lost someone to war's shadow. Sarah, haunted by the name. Pierce pushed her contacts to dig deeper, sensing a story buried by time. The diner cook, interviewed by a local reporter, recalled seeing the man's truck every Sunday since she started her shift years ago. The image of the old man kneeling, flowers in hand, stirred something deep in the town, a reminder of what it meant to remember. Ethan hadn't meant to start a movement, but his photo had done just that, pulling a hidden act of devotion into the open. The cemetery, once silent, hummed with new life, its gates creaking under the weight of curious footsteps. Sarah's message to the Pentagon was only the beginning, a spark that would soon light up a truth long hidden. The photo wasn't just a moment captured. It was a window to a man's unspoken vow, now echoing beyond the grave he'd tended. But before the world could grasp the depth of his act, fate called him to his final rest, leaving a clue that would shake the Pentagon. The cemetery glowed under the tender light of a Sunday morning, its quiet paths cradled by the rustle of leaves dancing in a gentle breeze. William Harper knelt before the headstone of Lieutenant Daniel Pierce, his worn hands arranging a cluster of buttercups with a reverence honed by years of devotion. He pressed his palm against the stone's weathered surface, his voice a soft murmur, offering words that carried the weight of a long-held promise. With a slow exhale, he eased himself onto the grass, settling against the sturdy trunk of an old oak, its branches swaying like a quiet hymn. His gaze drifted to the sky, where clouds parted to reveal a sliver of dawn's promise, and a rare peace softened the lines of his face, as if he'd finally set down a burden carved deep into his soul. His breath slowed, his eyes fluttered shut, and without a sound, his heart ceased leaving him, still one hand resting near the earth where his flowers lay. It was nearing noon when Henry, the cemetery's groundskeeper, ambled through the rows of graves, his eyes catching a figure under the oak. His heart sank as he recognized Will, motionless, his expression calm like a man who'd found rest after a long journey. Henry had watched him come every Sunday, always with flowers, always tending the same grave. But this stillness was different, final. He knelt beside Will, his calloused hand seeking a pulse, finding only the gentle chill of departure. A quiet sorrow welled within him, not just for the loss, but for the steadfast ritual he'd come to respect. He pulled out his radio, his voice thick with emotion as he called for assistance, describing a scene that felt more sacred than tragic. A police cruiser arrived shortly, its lights dimmed in deference to the moment Officer Clara Nguyen, serving as an EMT volunteer, stepped into the clearing, her breath catching at the serene dignity before her. She confirmed Will's passing, noting no signs of struggle. Only a man who'd left the world as gently as he'd lived in it. The buttercups, vibrant and carefully placed, spoke of a task fulfilled their petals, stirring faintly in the breeze. As Clara and her partner prepared to move, they searched his coat, their hands pausing at a thick envelope nestled inside. Its surface bore a military code and a scrawled command, a detail that sent a shiver through Clara's spine. She held it up, her eyes meeting her partner's, both sensing this was no ordinary keepsake. The chief arriving to oversee dismissed it as a sentimental trinket, but Clara's quiet conviction ensured it was handled with care, sealed in an evidence bag, with a weight that lingered. Henry, standing nearby, shared what he'd seen over the years, Will's weekly visits, his flowers, his solitude, a story that felt like a whispered legend. His words stirred Clara, who felt a pull to know what drove such unwavering loyalty. The scene held a quiet reverence, a moment where the world seemed to pause, honoring a man who'd ended his days in service to a memory. Clara's thoughts turned to her own family, to stories of sacrifice she'd heard as a child, and she felt a connection to this stranger. The cemetery, with its soft earth and tangled vines, seemed to hold Will in a tender embrace, as if acknowledging his vigil. His passing was a silent symphony, its final note played in the place he'd cherished. The flowers, bright against the stone, stood as a testament to his resolve, a beacon of his unspoken vow. At the station, Clara filed her report, the envelope's presence a quiet challenge to her assumptions. The town, alive with talk of a photo shared that morning, knew nothing of the man who'd left them in this moment. Will's departure was a gentle close, a life defined by a promise kept until the end. Clara's quiet resolve to uncover Will's story would soon set in motion a journey to a truth he'd kept veiled for decades. Part 8. Hidden Records. A Forgotten Heroine. A quiet corner of the Pentagon, where fluorescent lights buzzed over rows of steel desks, Major Evelyn Carter sat alone, her hand steady as she sliced open the sealed envelope sent from the small-town police station, the wax seal bearing a military unit's code cracked under her letter opener, revealing a bundle of papers that carried the faint must of decades past. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded the first document, a military service record, its edges brittle, stamped classified in stark red ink. The name at the top read William Harper, and what followed was a story of valor that made her breath catch. 3 bronze stars, each earned for acts of bravery in Vietnam's jungles, gleamed in the file's dry prose, dragging wounded comrades through gunfire, holding a ridge against relentless odds. A Silver Star citation detailed a night when Will, under heavy fire, carried a dying soldier to safety, refusing to leave him behind. A commendation letter signed by Colonel James Whitaker, who vanished in a 1970 mission, praised Will's unyielding courage, calling him the backbone of their squad. But it was the final page that stopped her cold, a single sheet of lined paper covered in Will's uneven scrawl. "Pierce saved me, but I couldn't save him. I'll keep him alive in memory." The words were raw, a confession etched with guilt and resolve, a vow that explained the flowers, the grave, the years of silent devotion. Carter leaned back, her mind racing. This was no drifter's tale, but the record of a hero who'd chosen to fade into obscurity. She typed Will's name into a secure database, her fingers swift but deliberate. The screen flickered, pulling up a file riddled with redactions confirming his service in Alpha Company 3rd Battalion, alongside Lieutenant Daniel Pierce. The records showed Will had declined his medals, walking away from ceremonies and benefits after the war, a decision that baffled the clerks who'd archived his file. Why would a man of such valor hide from his own legacy? The note offered a clue, a debt he felt he could never repay, a wound that had shaped his life. Carter's eyes lingered on the commendation, its faded ink, a bridge to a night in 1968, when Will's squad faced annihilation. Whitaker's letter hinted at a bond between Will and Pierce, forged in the crucible of combat. She pulled a microfilm from the archives, her hands trembling as she loaded it into a reader. A grainy photo emerged. Will young and gaunt, standing beside Pierce, their faces lit with a weary camaraderie. Mud-stained uniforms, a testament to their shared ordeal. The image was a snapshot of a time when Will was more than a plumber, more than a shadow in a small town. Carter's thoughts turned to her father, a Vietnam veteran whose silences had taught her the cost of war. She felt a duty to honor this man, to pull his story from the shadows. She called her superior General Thomas Reed, a man known for cutting through bureaucracy, and briefed him in a voice tight with urgency. Reed listened, his usual stoicism giving way to a rare intensity, and ordered an immediate review of Will's file. The Pentagon's records office came alive. Clerks, sifting through dusty files to piece together a narrative long buried, Carter cross-referenced the unit code on the envelope, confirming its link to Pierce's service. The note's stark honesty struck her. Will had spent years keeping a fallen comrade's memory alive, a task he'd undertaken alone. The general, moved by the story, authorized a team to investigate further, sensing a need to right a quiet injustice. Carter's team found a memo noting Will's refusal of honors, a choice that had left his name in obscurity. The Bronze Stars, the Silver Star, the Commendation. They were not just awards, but markers of a life defined by sacrifice. She pictured Will kneeling at that grave, his hands placing flowers as a penance for surviving, when Pierce did not. The Pentagon, often a maze of protocol, felt a stir of purpose. Carter, holding the note, knew this was more than a case. It was a call to recognize a man who'd lived for others. The records hidden for decades were now a beacon, illuminating a truth that demanded to be seen. Will's story was no longer his alone. It was a legacy waiting to be claimed. The weight of that legacy would soon bring 2 Marine officers to a small town, marking a turning point in a story that refused to stay buried. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement outside William Harper's rundown apartment building, its peeling paint and sagging stairs, a stark contrast to the polished presence of 2 Marine officers standing at the door, Major Daniel Brooks and Colonel Laura Hensley. Their dress blues, crisp and medals glinting, carried an air of solemn purpose as they knocked on the faded wooden frame. The news of Will's death had reached them just days ago, carried by a Pentagon directive, sparked by the envelope found in his coat. They'd come to this small town not to mourn a stranger, but to unravel the story of a man whose quiet devotion had stirred the highest ranks. The door remained unanswered. The apartment silent, its occupant now gone forever. A neighbor peering through a curtain confirmed what they suspected. Will Harper had lived here alone, a recluse who'd kept to himself. The officers exchanged a glance, their mission undeterred, and stepped inside after the landlord. A wiry man with a skeptical frown unlocked the door. The apartment was a study in simplicity, a worn couch, a single lamp flickering weakly, and a kitchen table scarred by years of use. Brooks, his jaw set, carried a leather folder under his arm, its contents heavy with meaning. Hensley, her eyes scanning the sparse room, felt a pang of recognition. This was the home of a man who'd chosen to carry his burdens alone. They'd been briefed by Major Evelyn Carter, who'd uncovered Will's military record, but they needed more a connection to explain why he'd tended Lieutenant Daniel Pierce's grave for 15 years. Brooks opened the folder, revealing a photograph. Its edges yellowed, but the image clear: two young soldiers, Will and Pierce, grinning in a war-torn camp, their faces alight with the fleeting joy of camaraderie. The photo, pulled from Pentagon archives, was a relic of a bond forged in fire, and they hoped it held answers. Hensley traced a finger over the image, her voice low, as she wondered aloud what had driven Will to such steadfast loyalty. The landlord lingering by the door offered little. Will paid rent, fixed pipes, and spoke sparingly, a ghost in his own life. But as the officers searched the apartment, they found a small tin box under the bed, its lid rusted but intact. Inside was a single item, a dog tag. Not Will's, but Pierce's, its metal dulled by time. The discovery tightened Brooks's chest. This was no casual keepsake, but a talisman of a debt unpaid. They sat at the table, the photo and dog tag before them, piecing together a story that felt both intimate and vast. Will had never spoken of Pierce, not to neighbors, not to the town, but his actions. Those weekly flowers that hid in vow spoke louder than words. Hensley, a veteran of more recent wars, felt a kinship with Will's silence. She knew the weight of memories that couldn't be shared. Brooks, older and hardened by years of command, saw in Will a soldier who'd never stopped serving, even in solitude. They discussed the viral photo that had brought Will's ritual to light, marveling at how a single image had bridged decades of obscurity. The apartment, with its bare walls and faint smell of coffee, seemed to hold Will's presence, as if he'd left a piece of himself in its quiet corners. The officers knew their next step to honor Will's legacy, to ensure his story and Pierce's lived on. They thanked the landlord, who watched them leave with a mix of curiosity and unease, unaccustomed to such attention in this forgotten place. As they walked to their car, the photo in Brooks's hand felt like a charge, a call to do right by a man who'd asked for nothing. Hensley, her voice steady but warm, suggested they reach out to the town to find those who'd known Will, however faintly. The dog tag, now in her pocket, was a reminder of the bond that had defined Will's life, a bond they were determined to understand. The visit wasn't just protocol. It was a reckoning, a chance to give voice to a man who'd chosen silence. The town, still buzzing with the photo's impact, was unaware of the officers' arrival, but their presence marked a shift, a moment when Will's hidden sacrifice began to take shape. The apartment, now empty, stood as a testament to a life lived for another, its simplicity a mirror to Will's unyielding resolve. The officers drove away, their mission clear, their hearts stirred by a man they'd never met, but now felt bound to honor. Their resolve to honor Will's sacrifice would soon lead to an invitation, a ceremony where his and Pierce's story would shine before the world. Part 10. A tense ceremony. Honor amid controversy, the National Cemetery stretched across rolling hills under a somber autumn sky, its rows of white headstones standing like silent sentinels as a crowd gathered for a ceremony steeped in reverence. Bagpipes wailed a mournful tune, their notes drifting over the freshly polished headstone of Lieutenant Daniel Pierce, its inscription now sharp and clear, restored to honor a hero lost in 1968. A Marine honor guard, their rifles gleaming, stood at attention, ready to fire a salute that would echo through the morning air. The grave, once choked by moss and neglect, was adorned with a crisp American flag and a wreath of laurel, a symbol of victory and memory. At the heart of the ceremony, William Harper was named the Keeper of the Legacy, his 15 years of quiet devotion to Pierce's grave now a beacon of loyalty. The crowd veterans in faded caps, townsfolk clutching programs, and officials in pressed suits listened as Major Daniel Brooks spoke of Will's sacrifice. His voice steady but thick with respect. The air was heavy with pride, yet a ripple of tension stirred when a local reporter, a sharp-eyed man named Tom Grayson, pushed through the throng, his notebook raised like a challenge. Grayson, known for his biting columns, interrupted the proceedings, his voice cutting through the solemnity. "Is it possible Harper did this for attention?" he asked, his tone skeptical. 15 years of flowers only noticed after a viral photo sounds convenient. The question hung like a cloud, drawing murmurs from the crowd, some nodding, others bristling. Colonel Laura Hensley, standing beside the podium, stiffened, her eyes narrowing at the accusation. The bagpipes fell silent, and the honor guard shifted their discipline unbroken, but their unease palpable. Grayson pressed on, suggesting Will's ritual might have been a calculated act, a bid for posthumous fame rather than a selfless tribute. The crowd's mood wavered, torn between admiration and doubt, as the reporter's words sowed seeds of suspicion. A young Marine in the honor guard clenched his jaw, his thoughts on comrades he'd lost, offended by the implication that such devotion could be staged. Townsfolk who'd known Will as a quiet plumber whispered among themselves, unsure how to reconcile the man they'd overlooked with the hero. Now celebrated. The ceremony meant to unite teetered on the edge of division, its sanctity threatened by a single voice. Major Brooks stepped forward, his gaze firm, but measured, ready to respond when a hush fell over the gathering. A woman in the back, her coat plain and her steps hesitant, raised her hand, her presence unassuming yet commanding. The crowd parted, sensing something pivotal as she approached the podium, her eyes fixed on the grave. Brooks paused, nodding for her to speak, his instinct telling him this moment mattered. The woman, her voice trembling but clear, introduced herself as Margaret, a schoolteacher from a neighboring town. She held up a small, faded journal, its pages worn from years of handling. "I didn't know Mr. Harper well," she said, "but he fixed my classroom sink once years ago. He left this behind by mistake." The journal, she explained, contained dates and notes, each marking a Sunday visit to Pierce's grave, a private record of Will's commitment. The crowd leaned in, their skepticism fading, as Margaret read aloud a single entry. "Another year, Daniel. I'm still here." Her voice broke and tears glistened in the eyes of those nearby Grayson. His pen still shifted uncomfortably, his challenge now dwarfed by the weight of truth. The journal wasn't a boast, but a confession, a map of a man's quiet penance. Margaret's words restored the ceremony's purpose, pulling the crowd back to the heart of Will's story. The honor guard raised their rifles, firing 3 crisp volleys, each shot a punctuation mark of respect. The bagpipes resumed their melody, soaring as the flag was folded with precision and placed beside the wreath. The tension dissolved, replaced by a shared resolve to honor both Pierce and Will, whose lives were now intertwined in memory. Margaret stepped back, clutching the journal, her simple act a bridge between a solitary man and a community learning to see him. The cemetery, with its endless rows of heroes, felt alive, its silence a chorus of gratitude. The ceremony ended with a prayer, its words lifting like a vow to remember Will's legacy, once hidden. Now stood tall, a testament to a man who'd served in life and death. Margaret's quiet revelation would soon pave the way for another voice. A stranger whose words would deepen the bond between Will and Pierce. The National Cemetery stood hushed under the fading light of an autumn afternoon, the echoes of bagpipes and rifle volleys still lingering in the air as the crowd remained gathered around Lieutenant Daniel Pierce's restored grave. The ceremony, now softened by a renewed sense of unity, held its breath as a young woman stepped forward, her presence quiet but undeniable. Emily Carter, a 26-year-old librarian with a gentle demeanor, clutched a small wooden box, her hands trembling slightly as she approached Major Daniel Brooks at the podium. Her eyes, bright with emotion, scanned the faces before her, veterans, townsfolk, and officials, each waiting for her words. She opened the box, revealing a single photograph, its edges curled from years tucked away in her grandfather's keepsakes. The image captured two soldiers perched on a jeep, their faces lit with rare laughter amidst the grit of a war zone. One was Pierce, his helmet tilted back. The other was Will Harper, his grin wide and unguarded. Scrawled on the back in her grandfather's careful hand were the words, "Will Harper, the keeper of the promise." Emily's voice, clear yet laced with feeling, broke the silence as she began to speak. Her grandfather, Sergeant Robert Carter, had served alongside Pierce and Will, surviving the same brutal nights that had forged their bond he'd often spoken of. Will, she said, not as a hero in the spotlight, but as the one who never forgot. Grandpa told me Will was the only one who kept Pierce's name alive, she said, her words carrying a weight that stilled the crowd. He said, "Will made a promise, though he never told us what it was." The photograph found in a rusted trunk after her grandfather's passing was a treasure she'd nearly overlooked until the news of Will's devotion reached her small town. She'd driven hours to be here, compelled to share this piece of history, to show that Will's loyalty wasn't a solitary act, but part of a story her grandfather had cherished. The crowd leaned closer as Emily held up the photo, its faded colors vivid in their hearts. Veterans in the back nodded their own memories of lost comrades, stirred by the image. A young girl in the front row, clutching her father's hand, stared at the soldiers' smiles, sensing something sacred in their joy. Emily recounted her grandfather's stories, how Pierce's quick thinking had saved their squad more than once, how Will's quiet strength had held them together. Grandpa said, "Will carried something heavy after Pierce fell." She continued, her voice catching. He didn't know what, but he saw it in Will's eyes. The photograph, she explained, was taken days before that fateful ambush, a moment of light before the darkness. The words on the back, written years later, were her grandfather's tribute to a friend who'd kept faith with the fallen Emily's testimony, wove a thread through time, linking the past to the present, the war to this quiet cemetery. She handed the photo to Brooks, who accepted it with a reverence that spoke louder than words. The crowd, moved by her story, felt the weight of Will's vow, not as a solitary act, but as a ripple that had touched lives beyond the grave he'd tended. A retired general in the audience wiped his eyes, remembering his own promises to those he'd lost townsfolk, who'd once dismissed Will as a loner, now saw him through Emily's words, a man whose loyalty had endured across decades. The ceremony, already profound, took on a deeper resonance, as if the photograph had brought Pierce and Will back for a moment. Their laughter echoing in the stillness, Emily stepped back, her hands clasped her heart, full yet heavy. She'd come to honor her grandfather's memory, but found herself part of something larger, a community bound by a shared recognition of sacrifice. The grave, now gleaming under the soft light, seemed to stand taller, its flag fluttering gently. The Marines in the honor guard, their faces, stoic, felt a renewed sense of duty inspired by a man they'd never met. Emily's words lingered, a testament to the power of memory, of promises kept against the tide of time. The photograph now in Brooks's hands was more than an image. It was a bridge connecting a war-torn past to a present determined to remember the cemetery, with its endless rows of heroes felt alive with their story, its silence a canvas for their legacy. Emily's quiet act of sharing would soon inspire a new generation, carrying Will's devotion far beyond the grave he'd honored. The National Cemetery lay bathed in the gentle glow of a late autumn afternoon, its rolling hills quiet now as the crowd from the ceremony dispersed their hearts, heavy with the weight of a story newly uncovered. The restored headstone of Lieutenant Daniel Pierce stood proud, its fresh inscription catching the fading light, a silent testament to a hero remembered. Days after the bagpipes had faded and the honor guard had marched away, a new group approached the grave, their steps light but purposeful. A class of elementary school children no older than 10 walked hand in hand with their teacher. Ms. Clara Evans, each clutching a small bundle of wildflowers, daisies, clover, and buttercups gathered from a nearby field. Their young faces were earnest, their eyes wide with the gravity of the tale Miss Evans had shared in their classroom. She'd told them of William Harper, a man who'd walked alone to this grave every Sunday, bringing flowers to honor a friend, lost long ago. The children, moved by the simplicity of his act, had asked to visit, to carry on what Will had started. As they reached the headstone, they knelt in the soft grass, placing their flowers one by one, their small hands careful, mimicking the care they'd imagined in Will's own. Ms. Evans watched, her voice soft, as she guided them, explaining that this was more than a gesture. It was a way to keep a promise alive. The children's flowers mingled with the wreath left from the ceremony, creating a vibrant mosaic of color against the stone. A girl named Lily, her pigtails swaying, whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Harper," as if Will could hear her words carrying a sincerity that tightened Miss Evans' throat. The act was simple, yet profound, transforming Will's solitary ritual into a shared legacy, a bridge between generations. Back in town, news of the children's visit spread, stirring a quiet pride among those who'd attended the ceremony. The diner, once a hub of gossip about Will's reclusive ways, now buzzed with stories of the students, their small hands echoing a devotion they barely understood, but deeply felt. A retired mechanic sipping coffee at the counter remarked that Will's story had done what few could, reminded them to look beyond appearances, to see the heart beneath the surface. The children's act wasn't planned for headlines. It was born of a teacher's lesson and a class's desire to honor a man they'd never met. Miss Evans, who'd read about Will in the local paper, had woven his story into a lesson on loyalty, telling her students how one person's quiet choice could ripple through time. The students, captivated, had drawn pictures of Will at the grave, their crayons capturing flowers and a lone figure under an oak. When they'd asked to visit the cemetery, she'd agreed, sensing a chance to teach them something lasting. The visit wasn't a one-time event. The class vowed to return to keep the grave adorned as Will had done. Parents, moved by their children's resolve, began to share the story, and soon other schools reached out, asking to learn about the man who'd kept a friend's memory alive. The cemetery, once a place of solitude, became a quiet pilgrimage site, its gates welcoming those drawn by Will's example. A local veteran, who'd served in a different war, brought his grandson to lay a single poppy, explaining that Will's loyalty was a lesson in what it meant to serve. The flowers, wild and unassuming, became a symbol of continuity, a reminder that memory could outlive those who carried it. The children's act stirred a deeper empathy in the community, a recognition that Will's life, though solitary, had touched something universal: the human need to remember, to honor, to stay true. A shopkeeper who'd once grumbled about Will's late rent donated a small plaque for the grave engraved with a simple line, "In memory forever kept." The gesture wasn't grand, but it was heartfelt, a nod to a man who'd taught them to see differently. The students back in their classroom wrote letters to Will, their words scrawled with the honesty of youth, thanking him for showing them that small acts could matter. Miss Evans pinned the letters to a bulletin board, a quiet tribute to a story that had reshaped her teaching. The legacy wasn't just in the flowers, but in the way Will's story had softened hearts, urging people to look for the unseen, to value the quiet strength in others. The cemetery, with its rows of heroes, felt alive with their presence. Its silence a chorus of shared memory. Will's story, now carried by young hands, would soon find its final echo in a note he left behind, offering a lesson that would linger long after. The small apartment where William Harper had lived stood silent, its worn walls holding the echoes of a life lived in quiet resolve. In the days following the ceremony at the National Cemetery, a volunteer group from the town, moved by the story of Will's devotion, came to clear out his belongings, hoping to preserve what little remained of the man who'd touched their hearts. Amid the sparse furnishings, a sagging couch, a chipped coffee mug, a single lamp, they found a small leather-bound notebook tucked beneath a loose floorboard, its pages yellowed but intact. The group's leader, a retired librarian named Susan, opened it with care, her fingers tracing the faded ink of Will's handwriting. The final entry, dated the Sunday of his passing, read in a steady scrawl, "I kept my promise, and now you live on in their hearts." The words, simple yet profound, were a final testament to Will's unwavering commitment to Lieutenant Daniel Pierce, a vow that had outlasted his own life. Susan's voice trembled as she read the note aloud to the group, their eyes glistening with the realization that Will's quiet act had become a legacy far greater than he'd ever imagined. The notebook, filled with years of brief entries, dates, flower types, weather notes, was a map of his fidelity, a record of a heart that refused to let go. The volunteers sat in the dim light, passing the notebook among them, each page a whisper of Will's enduring loyalty. Outside, the town was changing, shaped by the story that had begun with a single photograph and grown into a movement. At the cemetery, fresh wildflowers now appeared regularly at Pierce's grave, placed by hands young and old, a silent continuation of the ritual Will had begun. A teenage boy inspired by his history, teacher's retelling, brought a handful of clover one morning, his act unnoticed but heartfelt. An elderly widow who'd lost her own son to war left a sprig of daisies, her tears mingling with the dew. The grave, once forgotten, had become a beacon, its headstone a canvas for a community's rediscovered reverence. The flowers, unpretentious and wild, carried a message that transcended words. Loyalty could endure beyond a lifetime, and redemption could be found in the smallest acts. Susan, clutching the notebook, shared its final words with the local paper, and soon Will's note was quoted in sermons, classrooms, and veterans' halls, its simplicity striking a universal chord. People who'd never met him felt a connection, a reminder that even in solitude, one person's choice could ripple through time. A young mother reading the story to her children spoke of Will as a man who proved that promises mattered. No matter how unseen, a factory worker hardened by years of toil paused at the tale, vowing to call an old friend he'd let drift away. The lesson wasn't loud or grand. It was quiet, like Will himself, but it sank deep, urging people to honor those who'd shaped them, to keep faith with the past. The cemetery, with its rows of silent heroes, seemed to hum with new life, its paths worn by those drawn to Pierce's grave, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. The town, once quick to overlook Will, now saw him in every small act of kindness, a neighbor fixing a fence, a stranger holding a door. His story had softened their edges, teaching them that no one deserved to be forgotten, that even the smallest gestures could build a legacy. The volunteers, finishing their work, left the apartment with the notebook in hand, donating it to the local historical society, where it would be displayed as a relic of quiet heroism. The flowers at the grave continued to bloom, a living testament to a man who'd lived for another Will's life. Though solitary, had woven a thread through the community, binding them to a truth as old as time. Loyalty, steadfast and unyielding, could outlast even death. His promise to Pierce, kept through years of solitude, had not only redeemed his own guilt, but had sparked a movement, a reminder that memory was a sacred act, a way to keep those alive. The notebook's final words became a mantra, whispered by those who heard the story, a call to live with purpose, to honor the unseen, to cherish the bonds that defined us. The cemetery stood as a quiet guardian, its wildflowers swaying in the breeze, each petal a nod to Will's enduring vow. The lesson was clear, etched into every heart that listened. Small acts done with love could forge an eternal legacy, ensuring no one was ever truly gone. As the sun set over the grave, casting a golden hue across the stone, Will's story lived on a light that time could not dim. And in that enduring light, a final piece of Will's legacy would find its place, leaving a lesson that resonated with all who heard it. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the National Cemetery, where Lieutenant Daniel Pierce's grave stands adorned with wildflowers, William Harper's story lingers like a quiet melody resonating in the hearts of those who've heard it. From a solitary man tending a forgotten grave to a legacy that inspired a community, Will's unwavering loyalty to a fallen comrade has shown us the power of a promise, kept his notebook with its final words. "I kept my promise, and now you live on in their hearts," is more than a farewell. It's a call to remember to honor those who've shaped us, no matter how small the act may seem. The children who now place daisies and clover at Pierce's grave carry forward a tradition born of one man's quiet resolve, proving that even in a world that moves too fast, a single act of devotion can ripple through generations. Will's life, marked by solitude and sacrifice, teaches us that no one should be forgotten, that every story matters, and that redemption can be found in the steadfast refusal to let go. His flowers, simple and wild, remind us to look for the unseen, to cherish the bonds that endure beyond time. What small promise have you kept or wish to make to honor someone in your life? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep this conversation alive. If Will's story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to hear more tales of quiet heroism that remind us what it means to be human. As we leave this cemetery where new blooms continue to appear, we carry with us a lesson etched in memory. Loyalty, in its purest form, is a light that never fades, a legacy that lives forever in the hearts of those who choose to remember.